Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this session. You know who everyone is on stage, so I'm not going to do long introductions, but I am just going to say a couple of things. Congressman Lawler does an amazing impression of Donald Trump, and I'm hoping he'll bring that out during the conversation. Unless ChatGPT is incorrect, Senator, I believe it's your birthday today.
I paved the way for Jack McCain.
And Chris, if we get a Donald Trump impersonation over here, I hope we get a Xi Jinping impersonation from the
That's a tougher one.
If Josh Rogan is still in the audience, I'd just like to point out, my wife is Japanese, so we have visa-free travel to many countries, but Ireland is about 2 countries below Japan, and we're hoping to pass them out next year. So now, US-China, Donald Trump is going to go to Beijing within 2 weeks. I'd like to ask all of you, where do you think US-China relations are right now? When you talk to officials in Washington, they'll often say, we're in a period of strategic stability. Do you agree with that? Is that the right policy? Or is the US hands tied because China has played the rare earths card and the US cannot do many things that it would like to do? Congressman Lawler, Mike, would you like to start?
Well, thank you, Demetri, and certainly it's great to be here with all of you. Some of you may have known I got my start in politics as an intern for Senator McCain back in 2008 on his presidential campaign. So it's certainly a great honor to be here and participate. And I want to thank Cindy for all of her hard work with the World Food Program over the last few years. She's done a tremendous job. So, look, I think obviously, as we all know, China is our greatest geopolitical foe. As I've talked about extensively as a member of the Foreign Affairs Committee, and I see my colleague Don Bacon here, and I know Stephanie Bice just spoke. The unholy alliance between China, Russia, and Iran has been something that I have focused extensively on to combat the malign influence and the work that China does day in, day out to undermine the United States and the free world. And I think, Congress certainly has taken seriously the threat posed. We have had extensive work done on the China Select Committee. I have focused extensively as chair of the Middle East and North Africa Subcommittee on the illicit oil trade between China and Iran. 90% of the petroleum that Iran sells goes to China. And so, I think we obviously recognize the threats posed, but at the same token, they are a force and a country that we have to deal with, both from a trade standpoint, from a rare earth mineral standpoint, from a military standpoint, what they have done to expand their reach in the Indo-Pacific. We've seen what they've done through economic coercion to seize control of ports and waterways around the globe. I think the president was right when he talked about the Panama Canal and getting China out of there. That was an important step forward. I have focused on issues like export controls with respect to the remote access bill that I was able to pass through the House, because the reality is, while we have export controls on our technology, they are getting access to it through remote cloud-based services. And so we need to grapple with that. That's something that's sitting in the Senate right now. So hopefully you guys will take that up. But it is, I think we're at a point where if you look at what is happening, whether it's with Venezuela, whether it's with Iran, part of the strategy is to start to have the bottom fall out on China's strategic relationships and putting pressure on the network that they have built. And so while there are things that we are taking China on directly with trade and other important issues, I think a lot is happening that is actually starting to decay the strategic relationships that they have built over these past 2 decades.
Senator, how do you see it?
Well, number one, I just am so happy to be here at McCain, where you started, but because we have trouble in Washington, and to be talking with people who believe in character-based leadership and purpose-driven engagement is really, really refreshing, and it has to prevail ultimately. On China, there is unity, bipartisan unity, on the China threat. Massive IP theft, forced tech transfer, the big trade surplus. Those things, I think, have united us. And actually, I think Trump spoke to those very effectively in becoming president. There is no consensus on how to address that, because the fundamental approach that the Trump administration has been taking on dealing with foreign policy, but China in particular, is instead of it being a values-based approach, it's a transactional approach. Instead of it being with allies, it's being unilateral. And that's where there is incoherence. In Congress, we have done one thing, the CHIPS Act, which is bipartisan and was about our trade. And then second, Mike, you're right, that bill you passed in the House, it's in the Senate, we should pass that. But there's real division between the parties because the Trump administration approach on this is one which I think can only fail. All right? We cannot be doing what we're doing to our allies in Europe and expect that we're going to prevail against China by going it alone. What we're doing in Iran is obviously accelerating the fragility of our relationships that we need to ultimately prevail against someone who's very aggressive and very focused. The things we've done on energy, where China is pursuing a policy actually of energy independence, as opposed to reliance on fossil fuels, is weakening us in terms of the long-term challenge with an AI-driven economy. So the biggest challenge from my point of view that we have in dealing with China is not what China's doing. It's what we're failing to do, and we're failing to do things that are in our interest that make us stronger. And that does require that we have a decision that I hope would be bipartisan, that we're better off with allies than acting alone. And we're better off on a values-based approach than we are on a transactional approach that has incredible limitations.
Chris, in Beijing, how do you think, again, ahead of the summit, how do you think Xi Jinping is looking at the relationship with the U.S. at the moment?
Yeah, I think to your question about strategic stability, and I thought it was interesting that you suggested that maybe strategic stability and their rare earth card are mutually exclusive or something. To me, they go together. But the U.S. can also seek strategic stability while acknowledging, the stranglehold the Chinese have and seek it for other reasons. I think what's interesting to me about it is how do you define stability? What is your goal with stability? I think for President Trump, it's sort of no trouble with China, especially given the current circumstance with the Iran war. But I think it's also a certain desire of his to perhaps be the architect of a grand bargain, right, with Xi Jinping and find his way into the history books that way. I think that idea is very appealing to him. I think one thing that's interesting about Trump's approach is that anything is possible, right? He's not constrained by previous U.S. policy or anything along those lines. He has full freedom. And I think the Chinese have followed an arc in their understanding of Trump, in that regard. I think they started very angry with Trump in the first term for good reason, right, from their perspective in terms of the tariffs and so on and so forth. And I think they expected when Biden came along, things would go back to normal and we'd have 50 dialogues and, kind of get back to the good old days. That didn't happen. And so I think with the second Trump administration, they've sort of seen maybe this guy is the best we're going to get on certain of our key objectives. I think Xi Jinping defines stability in the relationship as buying time to do a couple of things. One, continue to get the Chinese military, the People's Liberation Army, in order to do its job in Taiwan. It's a little difficult to launch a war when you have no generals. And also, I think the second piece of it is to continue to develop freedom, if you want to call it that, from these U.S. chokehold technologies, chips, et cetera. And we see that in the context of the 5-year plan that was just last month. And then I think thirdly, it is to complete the task in his mind of hollowing out the global manufacturing supply chain and securing Chinese dominance in that chain.
Maybe I can ask an open question to all three of you. So during the Biden administration, after the Chinese balloon incident, once diplomacy started kicking off again, Biden was putting a lot of export controls on China, but he was also engaging with China. And the criticism from Republicans, and a few Democrats, mainly Republicans, was that he was engaging in zombie diplomacy. Is what President Trump's doing now, is that zombie diplomacy or is that different? And if it's different, what's different?
What kind of diplomacy?
Who would like to?
What kind of diplomacy?
Zombie diplomacy. So diplomacy that you go there, you do something, doesn't actually produce anything.
You know, we've got to take this down a level. I mean, what you talked, Chris, about strategic stability, it was very abstract to me. We lost millions of jobs. And it was a result of policies that were supported in many cases by Republicans and Democrats. That has created an incredible challenge for our country. It really is bipartisan. And the goal on our foreign policy can't just be, quote, stability. It's got to be, how does our foreign policy serve the interest of everyday American people? And what we're seeing now, when we're talking about Trump and how to deal with him, that's impossible, right? Who knows how to deal with Trump? Trump doesn't know how to deal with Trump. You've got to have a policy that is grounded in what are the outcomes you're trying to achieve. And of course you want to have stability, like on nuclear areas. On AI, actually, we should be trying to work some with China on that because of the threat that it can be. But I do believe that there was bipartisan concern about what China had done to our economy. And we played the blame game on that. But there was a unified approach among, I think, us in Congress about the IP theft and the other that I mentioned. So now to have an erratic policy where the president supported NVIDIA chips, not the absolute best, but the very good ones, going to China and getting a cut, 15 to 25% for the U.S., that makes no sense. That's not a policy. That's a transactional approach where you get a sugar high because you, quote, make a deal, but you don't start establishing the foundation for a sustainable approach that's going to be beneficial to the American people. And then secondly, the repudiation of having alliances with Europe and other Asian countries. And that is happening, and the transactional approach is weakening us. I mean, and this is where it's very difficult, because I find that with my Republican colleagues who are very articulate many times on this and speak very, very passionately about the need to help working class Americans, there's a real inhibition on being able to do something that deviates from Trump doctrine, because there's real political pain if they, with the exception of guys like Mike here and Don Bacon, who doesn't know better, when they deviate from doctrine. So I have a lot of respect for you guys and empathy for your situation.
You know that Peter Welch, okay? He says such nasty things over here. Good guy, great guy. Unlike that Jason Crow, okay? No, look, look, China is one of those issues that I think does generally unify Republicans and Democrats. And yes, there are some different opinions on how to deal with certain aspects of this. But I do think when you look at this in totality, Peter's absolutely correct. Over a 40-year span, we lost so many jobs, especially in the manufacturing, industry. I think about upstate New York. I'm just north of New York City, so anybody that is from New York City, no, I don't live in Canada. But the reality is, the I-90 corridor in upstate New York was decimated over a 40-year period, and all of Appalachia, and you see it. And so the objective, I think, broadly speaking, is to bring some level of manufacturing back, especially advanced manufacturing, with chips and technology. I also think, as we saw during COVID, we allowed the prescription drug precursors to go to China.
Right.
That was a mistake. It was a mistake for Puerto Rico, but it was a mistake for the United States to allow that. And I think, when you're talking about the supply chain, this is a critical element. Let the Chinese keep the cheap toys. But the reality is, on the advanced manufacturing, we need to get that back in the United States, or certainly in concert with our allies around the globe. I think part of this also is with respect to international trade routes, ports, waterways. What we're seeing right now in the Strait of Hormuz. Iran put up a blockade, okay. We put up a blockade of theirs. And the country that is most impacted by that, besides Iran, which is losing about 500 million a day, is China. Because China is heavily reliant on energy coming out of Iran. And so when we look at how we deal with this strategically, yes, the reality of President Trump is he wants to cut a deal. That is his mindset. That has always been his mindset. He wants to be liked. He wants people to have a good time. And what I mean by that is he's somebody who's been in hospitality for 50 years. That is always in his mindset when he is dealing with people. But if something's not working, he will shift on a dime. And I think what people have to recognize in dealing with him on foreign policy is, especially on China, he understands they are our greatest geopolitical foe. He is the one that put the tariffs in place. Biden kept them, as you pointed out. How we isolate China economically and militarily is at the core, I think, of what the president wants, but also what Congress wants. Recognizing that we don't want to be at war with China, but we also don't want China to continually undermine the United States. When we talk about values, respecting intellectual property
Right.
and the rule of law is important, and China continually undermines that. They continually use economic coercion against other countries. We've seen their influence in the Western Hemisphere. We've seen their influence in Africa with the Belt and Roads Initiative. We've seen their influence throughout the Indo-Pacific as they expand in the South China Sea. So there are a lot of things that I think that are at play here. And part of this for us as a country is getting control of the supply chain, making sure that their military capabilities do not surpass ours in any way, but moreover, that their influence in key areas, and in particular in our own hemisphere, is diminished. And that's something that I do think we should all be focused on.
So maybe, Chris, if you can address this. So when President Trump goes to Beijing, with all these things in mind, what do you think he should be trying to get out of Xi Jinping, and what do you think he will get out of Xi Jinping?
Yeah, two very different things. Let me answer your question about zombie diplomacy, because I think it's important. My sense is that depends on how the administration is strategizing for this upcoming series of meetings. We're having, if it goes according to plan, we're having an unprecedented year. The U.S. and Chinese leaders have never met 4 times in 1 year ever. So there's a lot of potential there. So I actually think both the Chinese, but more importantly, maybe President Trump, should get a bit of a break in the sense of course you don't want to do everything in round 1. And if you're President Trump, if there's a big something that's going to be signed, you want it done in Doral, Florida in December, would be my guess. And so if there's
a Mar-a-Lago deal.
Right. So if there's a strategy being built by the administration, I presume it would be stepwise through this series of summits. And again, to give President Trump a little bit of credit, I think he's been successful in really putting the screws to Xi Jinping about continual symmetry. One thing that I keep seeing, and we're seeing it just in the last few days on both sides with tit-for-tat things, is the working level in the two systems, because the way decision-making is running in the two systems these days, which are eerily similar, they can't seem to avoid doing stupid without a regular cadence of interaction at the presidential level to sort of, keep things stable. And so I think that's important. And sorry, your second question was?
What do you mean? What kind of a?
Oh, yeah. What will he get? Yeah. I think for him, he just wants the purchases. I think it's pretty straightforward. And so agriculture, Boeing's, his staff, I think very smartly, wants a more refined agreement from the Chinese on the rare earth deliveries. The reality is they've been cheating. Part of that is on the administration for not holding the Chinese to what they agreed to do in the Busan Agreement in terms of publishing guidelines for licenses and things like that. And I think Trump probably also would like to see some talk around investment of some kind or another. For Xi Jinping, I think he's willing to make the purchases if he gets that time that I mentioned earlier. For him, this current, in their way of thinking, 5-year plan period, and don't forget, he'll be embarking on a 4th term in a year, so there's that aspect in his mind. Does he want to signal the succession at all or not? These things are very front and center for him. So if he can get that with wheat, sorghum, corn, and Boeing's, he'll be more than happy to do so.
And Peter, Mike, can I ask you, what is the appetite in Congress to allow Chinese investment into the US, given that almost every industry these days relies on data and high tech, so it's much more sensitive than it would have been in the past? Are there industries where you think members of Congress would welcome Chinese investment?
There's none. I mean, ask Senator Grassley about farmland.
Yep.
And then there are now apprehensions that the president may, I've heard this from my Republican and Democratic colleagues, entertain having China manufacture electric vehicles here. I don't think there's any appetite for that. And if that's what the transaction is, they buy our grain after they boycotted our grain because of the tariffs. And where even if you get rid of the tariffs, Brazil now has that market. The idea of having China start investing in manufacturing here, I don't think has congressional support. I really do think, it's interesting listening to you, Mike, because I think there's real bipartisan concern about China and what it's done to our economy and the people we represent. We get in the way of each other a little bit about blaming because at this point we have to solve the problem. But, when I was on the Intelligence Committee my last 4 years in the House with Jim Himes, China was a major topic of discussion. And there are areas where we have to confront areas, but there's areas we have to compete and there's areas we have to cooperate. But the bottom line is that what's within our control are doing the things that strengthen us. Having allies strengthens us in relationship to China. Having self-sufficiency in the supply chain, strengthens us with China. Having policies that strengthen our agricultural sector where we're not dependent on their goodwill to buy our corn and soybeans strengthens us. And one of the aspects of this in Congress that's troubling to me right now is we've got this shared concern, I think, between Republicans and Democrats, but we don't have a shared approach to solve a shared concern. And that's where the politics gets in the way. And frankly, the transactional approach where you're looking for a deal that then you tout in the press and it's another great deal really escapes. It just doesn't get anchored in something that's sustainable as a policy that has the capacity to strengthen us and prevail over time.
If I agree with generally what Peter is saying, and especially I don't think there's really any appetite for Chinese investment in the United States. I think from the standpoint of China purchasing land by sensitive military locations, China purchasing farmland is a major concern. I can give you an example of something in my district. A few years ago, there was a company called H&A Palisades. It was a Chinese company that had purchased an old IBM facility. IBM is headquartered in my district. And this Chinese company turned it into a conference center, and then COVID hit, and basically everything shut down, and so the property went into disarray. They weren't paying their taxes. The Chinese Communist Party killed the owner of the company and seized control of it.
Wow.
And imagine that, and this really didn't make much news, and I don't frankly think many in Washington realize this, but the CCP controlled 109 acres of land 35 minutes from Wall Street. And Chase and Bloomberg have their data centers 5 minutes from this property. And so I was, at the time, deputy town supervisor in the town, and then I ran for the state assembly in New York. And the town supervisor, Teresa Kenny, they weren't paying their taxes, and so we took them to court, and we're going to seize the property through eminent domain. And fortunately, between that and SL Green had a case against HNA, SL Green ended up getting the property, and we got it out of the hands of the Chinese Communist Party. But imagine the Chinese Communist Party owning a property 35 miles from Wall Street and 5 minutes from two of the most important data centers in the country. That is a major catastrophe. And
next time you have a story like that and
Yeah.
no one's paying attention, please call the Financial Times.
But it just goes to show how much the Chinese, how sneaky they are, things they do that frankly can undermine us tremendously. It's just, I think from that standpoint, there is very little appetite, certainly on a large scale, and certainly when it comes to major industry, data centers, AI, quantum computing. Like I said, IBM is headquartered in my district. We don't want them anywhere near any of this. And I think that is, fundamentally part of the challenge when you're talking about any type of long-term deal with them.
I hate to put lawmakers on the spot, but I'm going to do it. You look at the Chinese, they have an authoritarian regime. I mean, it's a myth to think that they've no fault lines in their system. Of course they do. But they can push ahead a lot more quickly when they decide what direction they want to go in. You look at Washington, it's tough to keep the government open. Politics is very toxic. As you said, there's agreement kind of on where to go, but not on how to get there. Do you worry that US politics is basically getting in the way of having a coherent policy on China?
Yes. Look, Peter comes from a pretty democratic state, but has a Republican governor. I come from a democratic state, a Republican in a district that has 80,000 more Democrats than Republicans. That's home to the Clintons and George Soros. By no means a Republican bastion. Jim borders me on one side. Gottheimer borders me on the other.
Although Marjorie Taylor Greene said you were a Democrat the other day.
Marjorie Taylor Greene said I was a Democrat, that's true. But she's about the dumbest person to ever serve, but that's okay. Look, this is, I think we are in a real challenge in our country, and part of it is driven by, frankly, the insane gerrymandering that goes on across the country. 3 decades ago, over 100 seats were competitive in the House. Today, it's less than 30. I'm one of them. But somebody like Peter has always tried to work across the aisle. I try to work across the aisle. My best friend in Congress is Josh Gottheimer. We talk all the time. And I think, unfortunately, our politics has gotten so stupid, and people can't have honest dialogue about serious issues. We spend our time focused on who hates who. We allow the extremes in both parties to drive a lot of the conversation. A lot of focus is on stupid committees like oversight or judiciary as opposed to, intelligence and foreign affairs and financial services. And I just think the issues that we focus on in Washington were that we focus on what the bases of our parties want. And I think, the shutdown of Homeland Security was a perfect example of that. I don't think any member of Congress would honestly say shutting down Homeland Security for that amount of time was a good thing. But we've allowed the politics of the moment to drive decisions that are being made in Washington instead of looking at the larger issue. And so whether it's China, whether it is obviously the situation in Iran right now, whether it is housing or healthcare or permitting reform, something I think most of us would agree needs to get done when it comes to energy policy, that takes a back seat to the politics of the day. And I think all of us have a responsibility to try our level best to push through that and tell the extremes in both our parties to shut the fuck up. Because they are truly what is driving the country into a place where it's difficult to deal with some of these larger issues.
Okay, now I have a lot more questions, but I think we'd like to give the audience a couple of questions.
I just want to add on, because I agree with a lot of what Mike said. And actually, the biggest sadness I have in serving is that when I talk to my colleagues, Republican or Democrat, if we're talking about what's happening to community hospitals where you live, what are kids doing coming out of college with big debt? What happened to those folks that were paying $900 for health care, but now that the tax credits have expired, it's $3,200 and they're dropping off? Everyone, the people who are experiencing those things experience the same pain. And that is not red state, blue state deals. I got a Trump voting farmer who called me up and said, Peter, if I don't get the extension on the tax credits, my family doesn't have health care. And it's the fact that we share these problems indicates we have to have a shared solution. And the political process is so broken that we don't have it. And it's not just a function of Congress. Institutional arrangements are breaking down. I mean, the atomization of our society, the fragmentation of news, the Supreme Court ruling about the Voting Rights Act, where it's not okay to take race into account, as the Voting Rights Act said, but they just gave a decision that it's okay to racially profile when you're picking people up for ICE. So we've got these factors that are pulling us apart institutionally, and it's really at our peril. So, you asked it in relationship to China, but it's true in relationship to healthcare. It's broken. It's true in relationship to the kids and the mounting debt they have. It's true, when I got out of law school, I had a chance to work on Wall Street and K Street. I ended up on Bridge Street and White River Junction. And I was a public defender, and I was making $9,000 a year. I had no debt. That was a choice I could make. In my apartment, and I had a choice of several, it was $135 a month. No, but seriously, Peter Welch today could not do that. That's not an option. So, what I find so necessary about what we're doing here in McCain is that it's not just the policy answer. It's the core approach that you take to life in politics. Because we've had enormous differences on every policy you can imagine. But there's been a shared sense of purpose in what our obligation is. And most of us, I think in Congress, like to believe that the folks we work with have the same objective that we have, and that's we want to try to make things a bit better for the people we represent. That's challenged now. You're kind of a sucker if you don't, elbow your way to the head of the line. And that's enormous threat to the well-being of our country.
Okay, I think we have time for one question, if anyone.
Or as John McCain would say, insults too.
Congressman.
Something that I've been reading this data that China's population is in rapid decline. So they're going to go to 1 billion in a few decades. And there was an article out this week that comparing the Chinese GDP and our GDP, it's gone down compared to ours the last couple of years.
Huh.
I wonder if they've now reached an apogee and we're seeing decline. Let's throw that out.
Yeah. Well, there's been a lot of debate about that. Recall maybe a year ago we had this peak China debate, right? Have they peaked on a number of these fronts? I think the demographic challenge obviously is very real. And what's interesting is I think one of the ways Xi Jinping thinks he'll deal with that, just like Japanese leaders think they'll deal with it and others, is robots, and advanced manufacturing and so on. He doesn't see it as a panacea, but I think he sees it as something that will help. I think the problem with the demographic analysis is that if the Chinese continue on the pace they are in terms of upgrading their economy, in other words, you need that vast population if you're still putting vacuum cleaners together with tiny hands. If your economy has moved up the value-added chain, you don't need as many people. So it's probably not as much, an issue as people think. The second thing is just sort of China has supposedly peaked several times before, and they keep showing they're not quite there yet. I'm not saying they will. I definitely think the way Xi Jinping has run the country has led to some of those results you identified, including the drop in GDP and a few other things. In his view, he's pursuing a particular vision, right? And it's worth it. And we'll see, right? It's unwritten at this stage.
Final question from here, yes, no answer. Donald Trump said Xi Jinping will give him a big, fat hug in Beijing. Will he, yes or no?
What?
Hug?
A big, fat hug.
Hug, yeah. No.
Chris, no?
Well, before I answer, when I was sitting down there, I thought this was gin.
How disappointing.
I wasn't drinking. I'm looking at
We can arrange that
over
later.
here, and he's like 3/4 of the way through it. I'm thinking, what's the matter with me? No, I don't.
No. Mike?
I'll say yes, because I think Trump will bring him in.
Pull him in.
All right, we'll see next year. Thank you very much to the panel and to the audience.
Great job.
Thank you.
Great job.